Late February 1943, the desert floor of Tunisia's Kasserine Pass is littered with the burning wreckage of the American Second Corps. Surveying the shattered tanks and abandoned artillery, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel reaches a definitive conclusion. These untested American newcomers are tactically naive and easily broken. By all conventional military logic, an army suffering such a catastrophic debut should require months to rebuild its doctrine and morale. But within a matter of mere weeks, Axis forces launching a follow-up offensive will collide with a completely unrecognizable, highly lethal military machine. How did a shattered army evolve so violently, almost overnight? The defeat in the Tunisian desert cost over 6,000 American casualties and left hundreds of tanks as smoking scrap metal. But the damage went far beyond the physical battlefield losses. Kasserine exposed profound, systemic rot within American military doctrine, communications, and senior leadership on a global stage. The world was watching, and the initial verdict was brutal. Popular history often reduces what happened next to a convenient cinematic cliché, a hard-charging, pearl-handled general arriving in a jeep to single-handedly whip a broken corps back into shape. But that post-war patriotic legend obscures a much deeper, far more complex historical reality. One charismatic savior did not miraculously fix the United States Army in North Africa. This investigation bypasses the mythology to uncover the actual mechanics of how a shattered force executed one of the most rapid organizational turnarounds in the history of modern warfare. We are going to examine the stark truth of institutional adaptation under extreme fire. How exactly does a massive, bureaucratic military machine, dismissed by the German High Command as a collection of bumbling amateurs, fundamentally rewire its own command culture in less than 30 days? How do desperate field commanders drastically overhaul artillery coordination, rewrite combined arms doctrine on the fly, and root out incompetent leadership, all before the enemy even realizes that the rules of engagement have completely changed? The speed of this pivot would soon prove fatal to Axis ambitions in Africa. But to fully comprehend the sheer scale of this desperate, real-time fix, we have to look past the burning wreckage. To understand how the army was rebuilt, we must first look closely at exactly why it was so systematically slaughtered in the desert to begin with. The United States Army that landed in North Africa during Operation Torch was not a hardened fighting force. It was a massive, heavily armed bureaucracy operating entirely on peacetime theory. For 2 decades, American military planners had debated the nature of modern mechanized warfare in lecture halls and during the staged, highly controlled war games of the Louisiana maneuvers. They had developed a highly specific, fundamentally flawed doctrine regarding exactly how armored warfare should be fought. At the heart of this institutional delusion was the American tank destroyer doctrine. According to War Department manuals, standard medium tanks like the M4 Sherman were never supposed to engage enemy tanks directly. Their assigned job was strictly to support infantry and exploit breakthroughs in enemy lines. To handle enemy armor, the American military had invented a completely separate branch: the tank destroyer battalions. The reigning theory dictated that when enemy tanks broke through a defensive line, highly mobile, lightly armored, and heavily gunned tank destroyers would rush to the sector, ambush the enemy armor from concealed positions, and eliminate the threat. On paper, across the sprawling, predictable plains of American training grounds, it looked like a perfectly rational, highly efficient division of combat labor. But the rugged, dusty valleys of Tunisia were not the training grounds of Louisiana. When this theoretical tank destroyer doctrine collided with the battle-hardened reality of Erwin Rommel's Afrika Korps, the result was a tactical massacre. The Germans did not operate in neat, predictable armored thrusts that could be easily ambushed by lightly armored vehicles. They utilized deeply integrated combined arms tactics, pushing forward with heavy panzers that were rigorously screened by devastating 88mm anti-tank guns and elite veteran infantry. When American tank destroyers, often early half-track models like the M3 gun motor carriage, which possessed virtually no armor protection, raced forward to intercept them, they were systematically obliterated before they even reached effective firing range. The specialized American anti-tank units were simply too fragile to survive the chaotic, concentrated firepower of a German armored advance. This failure left the American infantry and standard tank battalions fully exposed to heavy armored threats they were strictly forbidden and entirely unequipped to fight. This crisis in armored doctrine was immediately compounded by a profound lack of combat hardening among the American infantry. The foot soldiers of the U.S. Second Corps were physically fit and well supplied, but they were entirely green. They lacked the defensive cohesion and the instinctual battlefield awareness that only comes from surviving sustained, lethal combat. When ordered to dig in and establish defensive perimeters, American infantrymen routinely failed to construct proper, mutually supporting defensive networks. They dug shallow foxholes. They bunched up together for psychological comfort rather than spreading out to minimize the blast radius of incoming shells. They consistently failed to camouflage their positions against aerial reconnaissance, and, crucially, they rarely integrated their heavy machine guns and mortars into cohesive, interlocking fields of fire. When the veterans of the German 10th and 21st Panzer Divisions struck at American positions like Sidi Bouzid in mid-February 1943, they did not just attack physically, they attacked psychologically. Stuka dive bombers shrieked down from the North African sky, while concentrated German artillery barrages pounded the hastily prepared American lines. Under this terrifying, unprecedented pressure, the fragile American defensive cohesion simply evaporated. Entire battalions broke and retreated, abandoning perfectly functional heavy equipment, artillery pieces, and vital supply depots in their sheer desperation to escape the onslaught. They were learning the hardest lesson of modern warfare in real time: that individual physical courage is completely useless without institutional discipline and rigorous tactical coordination. Yet even the bravest, most disciplined infantry units cannot hold a line if they are fighting blind and deaf. Perhaps the most fatal and least understood vulnerability of the American forces in North Africa was their chronic systemic inability to communicate. The United States Army prided itself on its modern, heavily mechanized nature, relying heavily on a complex network of radio communications to coordinate its mobile units. But the violent reality of combat quickly exposed the extreme fragility of this electronic nervous system. The early American radio sets were highly temperamental. Their delicate vacuum tubes shattered easily when vehicles bounced violently over the rugged, rocky Tunisian terrain. Heavy batteries drained rapidly in the harsh desert environment, and the mountainous topography of the Kasserine region created massive terrain shadows and dead zones where radio signals simply disappeared into static. Furthermore, the Germans were absolute masters of electronic warfare. Experienced German signals intelligence units actively monitored, intercepted, and frequently jammed American operational frequencies. The result was a paralyzing, impenetrable fog of war. When forward American outposts were suddenly overrun by German armor, they often found themselves completely unable to warn the units stationed behind them. Platoon leaders could not reach their company commanders. Battalion commanders could not coordinate with neighboring units to secure their exposed flanks. Most devastatingly of all, forward infantry elements could not contact the rear echelon artillery batteries to call in defensive fire missions. Without the protective, devastating umbrella of heavy artillery, isolated American infantry and armor battalions were picked off one by one. They were destroyed piecemeal in isolated pockets simply because they could not ask for help, and Corps headquarters had no idea they were even under attack until it was entirely too late. This catastrophic breakdown in communication at the tactical level was perfectly mirrored by a staggering failure of leadership at the highest strategic echelon. The ultimate responsibility for the American Second Corps fell to Major General Lloyd Friedendahl. In the annals of World War II, few senior commanders have ever demonstrated a more paralyzing disconnect between rear echelon authority and the chaotic reality of the front line. While his unblooded, exhausted troops were struggling to hold their ground in the freezing, mud-slicked passes of the Atlas Mountains, Friedendahl was nowhere near the fighting. Instead, he had established his Corps headquarters nearly 70 miles behind the active front lines, hidden deep within a remote ravine near the town of Tebessa. Unnerved by the threat of German air raids, Friedendahl had actually ordered an entire company of combat engineers to abandon frontline duties and spend weeks blasting a massive, reinforced underground bunker complex into the solid rock of the ravine. It was a fortress of total isolation, quickly and derisively dubbed Speedy Valley by his own staff, and it became the physical embodiment of his deeply flawed command philosophy. Friedendahl rarely left his subterranean command post to inspect the front lines. He did not look his battalion commanders in the eye. He did not physically assess the rugged terrain his men were expected to defend, and he had absolutely no first-hand understanding of the immense logistical and psychological challenges his soldiers were currently facing. Instead, he attempted to micromanage a chaotic, highly fluid desert war from inside a concrete bunker, relying entirely on the deeply flawed, frequently delayed radio and telephone reports filtering back from the collapsing front. Worse still was his actual method of issuing orders. Friedendahl routinely bypassed his own divisional commanders, issuing direct, highly specific tactical orders to individual battalions and companies over the radio. He communicated in a bizarre, informal slang, issuing cryptic generalized commands to "use your heavy stuff" or "go get 'em," which only sowed massive confusion among frontline officers who were desperate for clear, coordinated strategic direction. When establishing defensive lines, Friedendahl obsessively split his forces. Rather than keeping divisions together to fight as cohesive, mutually supporting fighting formations, he chopped them into tiny, isolated fragments. He would place one battalion on a hill, another on a ridge miles away, and position his mobile reserves far too far back to offer any immediate tactical support. He created a static, heavily fractured defense that essentially invited the highly concentrated, rapidly moving German panzer columns to drive straight through the gaping holes and annihilate the isolated American pockets one by one. By the third week of February 1943, this lethal combination of factors finally reached critical mass. Naive peacetime military theory had collided fatally with the violent, unforgiving reality of veteran combat. The American armored doctrine had proven suicidal against combined arms tactics. The infantry was completely shattered, lacking the foundational defensive cohesion to hold their ground. The communications network had totally collapsed, leaving isolated units to face concentrated German armor entirely alone. And at the very top of the chain of command, a bunker-bound general was actively crippling his own forces through remote paranoid micromanagement. The resulting disaster at Kasserine Pass was not merely a localized tactical defeat. It was a systemic, catastrophic institutional failure. The entire American command structure in North Africa was rapidly unraveling under the pressure. Tens of thousands of American troops were actively losing faith in their weapons, in their peacetime training, and most dangerously, in their senior leadership. If the Axis forces decided to fully exploit the massive tear they had just ripped in the Allied lines, the entire North African campaign could be permanently lost. The situation had pushed far beyond the point where simple battlefield adjustments or shifting a few units could stabilize the front. The institutional rot was simply too deep. The crisis had reached an absolute boiling point, and saving the United States Army from total operational collapse would now require a ruthless, unprecedented administrative intervention. The ruthless administrative intervention required to save the Second Corps did not begin with a glorious counterattack. It began with a firing. On March 6, 1943, General Dwight D. Eisenhower made a cold, calculated command decision that would permanently alter the trajectory of the American military in World War II. He relieved Major General Lloyd Friedendahl of command. It was a brutal public severing of the entrenched bureaucratic mindset that had engineered the disaster at Kasserine Pass. To replace him, Eisenhower dispatched Major General George S. Patton, Jr., a commander who viewed combat not as a logistical puzzle to be solved from a bunker, but as a violent, kinetic clash of wills. Accompanying him, serving as Eisenhower's personal eyes and ears on the ground, was Major General Omar Bradley. The arrival of Patton in North Africa has been heavily mythologized. Post-war cinema and popular history have largely reduced his takeover to a series of theatrical displays. A pearl-handled revolver, roaring speeches, and a sudden, draconian enforcement of uniform regulations. It is a documented fact that Patton immediately instituted a regime of relentless, almost punishing discipline. He ordered severe financial fines for any soldier caught without a steel helmet, required neckties in the sweltering desert heat, and mandated that vehicles be constantly polished, even within active combat zones. But this superficial spit and polish was not a tactical solution. It was psychological shock therapy. Patton recognized that an army fundamentally lacking in self-respect could not hold the defensive line. He was systematically breaking the aura of defeatism, forcing a beaten corps to physically act like a professional, disciplined fighting force before they actually remembered how to be one. But the true operational turnaround, the structural pivot that actually saved the American forces in North Africa, had nothing to do with neckties. It was a matter of geography. Upon taking command, Patton and Bradley immediately targeted the systemic rot of rear echelon isolation. The era of the subterranean bunker was over. The new commanders ordered division, brigade, and battalion headquarters physically uprooted and pushed violently forward, directly toward the line of contact. They mandated that command posts be situated where officers could visibly see the terrain their men were actively fighting and dying on. This abrupt geographical shift sparked an immediate, intense culture clash within the American officer corps. For months, staff officers and bureaucrats had grown comfortable managing the war through delayed radio dispatches, safely insulated from the physical realities of combat. Now, majors and colonels were forced out of their secure rear area tents and thrust into the dust, the heat, and the immediate danger of the front lines. They were suddenly required to coordinate complex defensive maneuvers while under the direct physical threat of German 88mm artillery fire and Stuka dive bombers. The tactical results of this forced exposure were profound. By physically closing the distance between the commanders and the frontline infantry, the American military effectively bypassed its own failing communications network. When delicate radios shattered or frequencies were jammed by German signals intelligence, a battalion commander no longer had to wait hours for a runner to navigate back to a rear headquarters. He was already standing on the ridge, able to personally direct the movement of his companies. Furthermore, this forward presence fundamentally altered the psychological dynamic between the officers and the enlisted men. The American infantrymen, previously demoralized and feeling abandoned, now saw his commanders sharing the exact same physical risks. Yet, as vital as this ruthless purge of the command structure was, it was only the first step in a massive institutional overhaul. Pushing generals out of bunkers and forcing colonels into the line of fire cured the paralyzing blindness of the high command. But generals do not drive tanks, and colonels do not man heavy machine guns. Changing the location of a command post did not change the fact that the United States Army was still operating on deeply flawed, mathematically suicidal combat doctrines. The actual men on the ground, the shattered remnants of the armored and infantry battalions, still had to completely reinvent how they fought. And as Axis forces rapidly regrouped to launch their next major offensive, the newly reformed Second Corps had less than 3 weeks to figure it out. Was this visual helpful? Yes, no. The popular narrative of the American revival in North Africa usually ends with the defensive triumph at El Guitar in late March 1943. It paints a convenient picture of a newly disciplined Second Corps effortlessly hurling back German armored assaults, seemingly validating George Patton's aggressive command overhaul overnight. But archival records strip away this cinematic polish, revealing a much darker, far more brutal reality. When the American forces transitioned from static defense to offensive operations in the jagged, unforgiving ridges of central Tunisia, the myth of a frictionless turnaround instantly collapsed. Advancing into the rocky heights of Jebel el-Kabar and Jebel Berda, the newly reorganized American battalions collided with deeply entrenched, combat-hardened German Panzer Grenadiers and Italian Bersaglieri. The results were frequently disastrous. Despite the ruthless shakeup in high command, systemic coordination errors still plagued the front line. Infantry companies advanced without proper artillery synchronization, walking blindly into pre-sighted German mortar kill zones. Friendly fire incidents spiked as confused, exhausted units navigated the labyrinthine rocky wadis. Over consecutive days of brutal mountain fighting, American casualty rates soared, proving definitively that no amount of charismatic leadership or strict uniform regulations could instantly replace the hard, bloody currency of actual combat experience. Yet beneath these severe tactical blunders, a massive hidden machinery was quietly tilting the balance of the war. The decisive factor in the American recovery was not merely a change in attitude. It was the overwhelming, crushing weight of Allied logistics combined with rapid institutional learning. The friction of mountain warfare was violently grinding down both sides, but the arithmetic of attrition was fundamentally asymmetric. When Axis forces lost a veteran machine gun crew or a Panzer IV tank, they could not replace them. The German supply lines across the Mediterranean were being systematically strangled, starving their frontline units of essential fuel, ammunition, and reinforcements. Conversely, The American military operated with an industrial redundancy the Axis could barely comprehend. If an American armored battalion lost 20 M4 Sherman tanks in a botched assault, the logistical pipeline delivered 20 brand-new replacements off transport ships in Oran and Casablanca, moving them directly to the front lines within a matter of days. By the spring of 1943, the Allies were pumping over 1 million tons of supplies into the North African theater each month. But the Americans were not just throwing endless steel at the enemy. They were ruthlessly analyzing their own failures. After every bloody skirmish, field commanders were filing after-action reports, dissecting coordination breakdowns, and rewriting field manuals in real time. If an artillery barrage fell short, the communication protocols were immediately adjusted. If a tank destroyer was ambushed, its deployment doctrine was instantly revised. This was the true, terrifying evolution of the United States Army. It was not a magical, painless transformation, but a brutal, heavily armed corporation learning how to kill through trial, error, and an endless supply chain. Every mistake was paid for in blood, but every lesson was immediately integrated into the machine. This steep learning curve was systematically transforming a green force into a lethal instrument, building undeniable momentum toward a final ultimate test against a series of fortified mountain peaks that German commanders confidently believed were absolutely impregnable. The brutal arithmetic of industrial attrition and rapid institutional learning found its ultimate proving ground in the final weeks of April 1943. The objective was the heavily fortified Axis perimeter shielding the port of Bizerte, anchored by a formidable limestone massif known on military maps simply as Hill 609. This was not the chaotic open desert of Kasserine Pass, where mobile panzers could maneuver freely. This was static, deeply entrenched mountain warfare, exactly the kind of defensive struggle that heavily favored experienced German troops. Elite units, including elements of the vaunted Hermann Göring Division, had spent weeks blasting machine gun nests into the solid rock, pre-registering artillery coordinates on every approach, and constructing deeply layered defensive networks. They believed, with significant justification, that the terrain was virtually impregnable. By this point, the American Second Corps had undergone a critical shift in leadership. George Patton, having stabilized the command structure, had been reassigned to plan the invasion of Sicily. Tactical command of the Second Corps now rested squarely with Major General Omar Bradley. Bradley was not a flamboyant, pearl-handled showman. He was a meticulous, mathematically minded tactician, a man uniquely suited to the methodical dismantling of complex defensive systems. Under Bradley's command, the assault on Hill 609 demonstrated exactly how far the American war machine had evolved in just 2 months. The disjointed, piecemeal attacks of February were completely gone. When the 34th Infantry Division advanced against the mountain, they did not walk blindly into pre-sighted kill zones. Instead, the infantry moved forward in highly coordinated synergy with devastating, synchronized artillery barrages, utilizing the newly revised communication protocols that linked forward observers directly to the rear batteries. But the most striking evolution occurred in the integration of armor. In a direct repudiation of the rigid pre-war doctrine that insisted standard tanks were never to be used against fortified positions or enemy armor, American commanders adapted on the fly. When the infantry assault stalled against entrenched German machine gun nests, M4 Sherman tanks were brought forward, not to exploit a breakthrough, but to act as mobile, heavily armored artillery pieces. In a radical departure from the disaster at Kasserine, the tanks did not charge wildly ahead. They advanced slowly, deliberately, in tight coordination with the infantry. When a German position opened fire on the advancing riflemen, the American infantry would immediately hit the dirt and radio the coordinates to the supporting Shermans. The tanks would then methodically blast the machine gun nests out of the rocks with high-explosive 75mm shells. This improvised, highly integrated combined arms tactic systematically dismantled the German defensive network. It was not a matter of overwhelming courage. It was the ruthless application of synchronized, mechanized violence. The Axis defenders, accustomed to the disjointed American attacks of February, found themselves subjected to a methodical, crushing pressure that they simply could not counter. They could not outproduce the American artillery, and they could not break the tight coordination between the advancing infantry and the supporting armor. On May 1, 1943, after days of grinding, vicious combat, American forces secured the summit of Hill 609. The capture of this anchor point shattered the entire Axis defensive line, shielding Bizerte. The collapse was rapid and total. Within days, the port city fell, trapping hundreds of thousands of Axis troops against the sea. The resulting surrender in Tunisia was catastrophic for the Axis powers. Over 250,000 German and Italian soldiers laid down their arms, a loss of manpower and material that rivaled and in some metrics exceeded the disaster at Stalingrad just months prior. Among the captured were seasoned veterans, elite panzer commanders, and vital logistical staff that the German war machine could not easily replace. The smoke cleared over the North African desert, revealing a radically altered strategic landscape. The American army that stood amidst the wreckage of the Axis surrender was completely unrecognizable from the naive, fractured force that had been so easily shattered at Kasserine Pass just 12 weeks earlier. They had paid an exceptionally high price in blood, but they had absorbed the harshest lessons of modern warfare, rewired their internal mechanics, and emerged as a highly professional, brutally effective military instrument. When Field Marshal Erwin Rommel first surveyed the burning wreckage of the American Second Corps at Kasserine Pass, his assessment was entirely logical, based on conventional military history. He saw a naive, structurally flawed army that had fundamentally failed its first test of modern warfare. In the traditional European martial mindset, such a catastrophic breakdown of doctrine and morale dictated a long, slow process of withdrawal, re-evaluation, and retraining. The German High Command calculated that it would take the Americans months, if not a year, to rebuild their shattered divisions into a credible fighting force. This was the fatal miscalculation. The defeat in the Tunisian desert was not the end of an army. It was the violent, necessary dismantling of an obsolete peacetime bureaucracy. The rapid transformation that followed bypassed the simplistic mythology of a single charismatic general single-handedly saving the day. The true weapon the United States deployed in North Africa was its unprecedented institutional flexibility, the capacity for rapid, ruthless self-correction under extreme combat pressure. When the pre-war tank destroyer doctrine failed, it was instantly rewritten. When bunker-bound leadership proved fatal, the command structure was physically pushed to the front lines. When communication networks shattered, new protocols were forged in real time. This structural evolution was underwritten by an industrial logistics pipeline that absorbed losses which would have paralyzed the Axis forces. The American military did not win in North Africa because it was inherently braver. It won because it functioned as a highly mechanized corporation capable of identifying systemic failure and rapidly engineering a solution on the battlefield. Every tactical error at Kasserine was paid for in blood, but the lessons were immediately integrated into the machine. This painful, compressed learning curve established the brutal, pragmatic foundation of the modern American military. The hard-won doctrines of combined arms coordination, forward command presence, and synchronized artillery support were not merely temporary fixes. They became the permanent operational blueprint. The army that stood victorious over the Axis surrender in May 1943 had shed its peacetime illusions. The fire of Tunisia had burned away the theoretical dogma, forging the professional industrial-age military instrument that would soon carry the Western Allies across the beaches of Normandy and directly into the heart of Germany. When Field Marshal Erwin Rommel stood among the burning American wreckage in February 1943, his tactical assessment of the green, disjointed troops he had just defeated was completely and historically accurate. His fatal strategic error and the profound miscalculation that would ultimately doom the Axis campaign in North Africa was his deeply ingrained assumption that the shattered, fundamentally flawed army he broke at Kasserine Pass would be the exact same force returning to fight him in the spring. He simply could not comprehend that this unprecedented enemy was not a traditional military establishment requiring years to rebuild, but a relentless, highly adaptable industrial organism capable of ruthlessly rewriting its own combat DNA between the bitter end of one battle and the violent dawn of the next.